In the year 1838, Georgia stood as one of the wealthiest regions in the American South. The cotton boom had transformed plantations into empires of wealth and influence, their owners wielding almost unchecked power over both land and people. Behind the white-columned mansions and sweeping fields of green lay a system of brutality that thrived in silence. To the outside world, plantation masters appeared as men of honor, refinement, and leadership, pillars of their communities. Yet behind closed doors, many carried secrets far darker than the public ever imagined. Among these hidden horrors was a story whispered only in fragments, pieced together by letters, diaries, and testimonies passed down in silence. It is the story of a plantation owner in Georgia who sought absolute control, not only over the people he enslaved, but also over his own household. His wealth was vast, his reputation secure, and his influence untouchable. But beneath the polished veneer of respectability was a man consumed by ego, power, and a desperate obsession with his legacy. For the wives of such men, life on a plantation often meant silent suffering. They were expected to embody loyalty and grace, their role confined to the household and the image of respectability. But in private, many endured humiliation, betrayal, and cruelty, pressured to accept what society demanded they ignore. The mistress of this particular Georgia plantation found herself trapped in such a cage, powerless to resist the whims of her husband and forbidden by culture and custom to speak out. Her silence became a haunting symbol of the way women were bound as tightly as those enslaved in the fields outside their doors. Different chains, but chains all the same. The story grows darker still when we look beyond the walls of the plantation home and into the lives of those forced into labor. Enslaved men, women, and children bore the physical burden of the master's wealth, yet they also carried his cruelty in ways that extended far beyond the whip and the field. Their humanity was stripped away by laws that defined them as property, their voices stifled by a system designed to erase resistance. And yet, within this silence, whispers of defiance remained, songs sung in the fields, stories passed at night, and eyes that carried knowledge too dangerous to be spoken aloud. What makes this Georgia story particularly chilling is the way it intertwines three forms of suffering: the greed of the master, the humiliation of the wife, and the dehumanization of the enslaved. Each was locked in a cruel dance of silence, held together by a society that looked away. Neighbors knew, servants whispered, and rumors circulated, but no one dared to challenge the illusion of honor that cloaked the plantation's reputation. To do so would mean not only social exile, but also the threat of violence. And so, the cycle of silence fed the cycle of abuse. The documents that survive, letters hidden in family chests, accounts written decades later, and fragments preserved in memory, reveal a chilling picture. They tell us that cruelty was not only in the fields, but also in the homes, woven into the fabric of daily life. They remind us that the horror of slavery was not just the backbreaking labor or the lash of the whip, but also the countless intimate betrayals that tore families apart, destroyed trust, and left scars that history has too often overlooked. This tale from Georgia in 1838 is not an isolated story, but it stands as one of the clearest windows into the hidden cruelty of plantation life. It forces us to confront the reality that the grandeur of the Old South was built on a foundation of suffering and silence. It demands that we see past the white columns and manicured gardens into the shadows where truth lay buried. As we turn the pages of this history, we are not simply recounting the sins of one man. We are uncovering a system of power, control, and exploitation that shaped lives and legacies in ways still felt today. This is not just Georgia's story, it is America's. And to tell it fully is to honor those whose voices were silenced, to confront the darkness that respectability once tried to hide, and to remember that history is not always written by the victors, but sometimes by the whispers left behind. In 1838, Georgia stood as one of the most prosperous regions of the American South. Vast fields of cotton stretched across the land like a sea of white, feeding not only the state's economy but also the wealth of an entire nation. At the center of this prosperity were the plantations, grand estates with towering columns, sprawling grounds, and carefully cultivated images of refinement. Their owners prided themselves on wealth, honor, and legacy, presenting themselves as the guardians of tradition and the epitome of Southern gentility. Yet beneath this polished surface, their fortunes were built upon a foundation of exploitation, cruelty, and silence. The plantation system was not merely an economic enterprise, it was a theater of power. Each grand mansion was a stage upon which the master displayed his wealth to guests, neighbors, and rivals. The manicured gardens, imported furniture, and glittering chandeliers served as symbols of his triumph over the land and over the people who worked it. But every brick in those grand houses, every polished floorboard, and every ripe field of cotton had been paid for by the suffering of enslaved men and women whose names were rarely recorded, whose lives were rarely remembered. To the outside world, these planters were aristocrats of a new kind, the Southern elite who commanded respect and influence in both politics and society. They were often invited to serve in local government, to lead church congregations, and to represent the values of their communities. Their wives hosted dinners and balls in shimmering gowns, and their children were taught to carry themselves with the pride of inherited privilege. Visitors from the North or from Europe were dazzled by the sight, often describing the plantations as emblems of Southern grandeur. Few looked closely enough to see the cracks in the foundation. But behind closed doors, the wealth of these plantations carried a hidden cost, one measured not in dollars but in lives. The system demanded not only the physical labor of the enslaved, but also their very humanity. Families were torn apart when sons and daughters were sold to other plantations. Women bore children whose fathers were not their husbands but the masters who claimed them. Every life on the plantation, black or white, enslaved or free, was shaped by the unyielding demands of power, control, and appearances. The obsession with legacy was at the heart of this system. For a plantation owner, wealth was not enough. His fortune had to endure through his bloodline, passed from father to son, carried forward by heirs who would ensure the family name never faded from prominence. Land and property were valuable, but children were the true currency of legacy. To be childless was to risk obscurity. To have no son was to risk the collapse of everything a man had built. This relentless pursuit of legacy often drove men to acts of desperation, cruelty, and betrayal. The story of one Georgia plantation master in 1838 captures this truth with chilling clarity. His estate was prosperous, his wealth secure, and his reputation untouchable. Yet beneath his roof, cracks began to form. His wife, whom society expected to serve as the delicate flower of the household, could not give him the children he so desperately craved. In a culture where women were often blamed for infertility, her worth as a wife was judged through the narrow lens of motherhood. Behind her gentle smiles at public gatherings lay humiliation and sorrow, for she bore not only her husband's disappointment, but also the whispered judgments of the community. But rather than face his legacy slipping away, this master sought to impose his will in ways that exposed the darkest heart of the plantation system. To him, enslaved women were not human beings but vessels of convenience, bodies to be controlled, manipulated, and used. The fields may have produced cotton, but within the walls of his household, he sought to cultivate something more personal, heirs who would carry his blood forward, no matter the cost. It was not love or family that drove him, but power, ego, and the desperate need to prove his dominance over both land and life. The wealth of his plantation, like so many others, gave him cover. To his neighbors, he remained a respected figure, a man of stature whose influence reached far beyond the borders of his estate. They might have whispered about his household troubles, but few dared to confront him openly. To challenge such a man would mean risking one's own position, one's own safety, even one's own fortune. And so, silence prevailed. His cruelty thrived in the shadows, protected by the very wealth that gave him status. Meanwhile, his wife was left to endure the ultimate humiliation. Society demanded her loyalty, demanded her silence, demanded that she smile at dinners and stand proudly beside her husband in church pews. She could not voice her sorrow, could not admit the torment she witnessed, for to do so would mean disgrace, exile, or worse. Like the enslaved people who labored in the fields, she too was trapped within the master's power, bound not by chains of iron, but by chains of expectation and fear. The enslaved, of course, bore the heaviest burden of all. To them, the wealth of the plantation was nothing more than a prison, its grandeur a mask that concealed brutality. The master's pursuit of legacy meant their lives were not their own. Their children could be taken, their bodies violated, their humanity denied. Each act of cruelty, each abuse of power, was justified in the name of wealth, honor, and legacy. And the world outside the plantation chose not to see. This keynote reveals the true cost of plantation wealth in Georgia during 1838. It was not measured only in cotton bales or in gold coins stacked high in a counting room. It was measured in the tears of enslaved mothers, in the humiliation of silenced wives, and in the quiet despair of those whose lives were consumed by a man's obsession with power. The grandeur of the Old South was built upon suffering, and every mansion that rose to the sky did so on the broken backs of those forced to carry it. To understand this story is to strip away the illusion of gentility and confront the truth that wealth and cruelty were two sides of the same coin. The hidden costs of power were borne not by the masters who flaunted their riches, but by the countless souls who had no choice but to endure it. And in that truth lies the haunting legacy of Georgia's plantations, a legacy that shadows history even today. In the South of 1838, legacy was more than a word. It was a creed, a burden, and often a weapon. For men who ruled plantations, their wealth and influence were meant to endure beyond their lifetimes, carried through bloodlines that stretched into the future. To be remembered, to have heirs who bore one's name, was the closest thing to immortality a man could claim. Land could be divided, fortunes could be lost, but family lineage was sacred. And it was within this context that one Georgia plantation master's obsession with control took root, a fixation so powerful that it poisoned not only his household, but the lives of everyone within his reach. From the outside, he appeared the model of Southern respectability. His estate thrived, his reputation gleamed, and his voice carried weight in political and religious gatherings. Yet privately, he battled a fear that gnawed at him more than financial ruin or public scandal ever could, the fear of dying without an heir. His wife, graceful and composed, could not bear him children. In the eyes of society, her failure was seen as her own, but for him, it was more than humiliation. It was an existential threat. Without a son to inherit his name and his lands, his carefully built empire risked collapse. Control became his answer. He sought to master not just his land and laborers, but time itself. Every decision, every cruel act was driven by a determination to secure his bloodline at any cost. He spoke of destiny and honor, yet what he pursued was domination, over nature, over people, over fate. He saw himself as the center of his world, a patriarch whose will could not be denied. This obsession began within the household. His wife, powerless in the face of cultural expectations, became both a victim and a witness. To her, marriage had been a union promised to bring stability and partnership, but what she found instead was humiliation cloaked in the rituals of respectability. The master demanded her silence, demanded her complicity, and demanded that she accept the choices he made in pursuit of his legacy. To resist him was unthinkable, for the weight of society, law, and faith all stood behind his authority. She lived in a cage gilded by wealth but strengthened by fear. His obsession spilled beyond the home and into the lives of the enslaved. To him, their bodies were commodities, their lives tools in his desperate bid for continuity. He reduced human beings to vessels, seeing in them not families, not individuals, but opportunities for his bloodline to continue. This cruelty revealed the darkest truth of the plantation system, that power could bend even the most intimate aspects of life into instruments of control. For him, enslaved women were not women, they were objects within his reach, and he felt entitled to shape their futures as he pleased. Such acts were not uncommon in the South, though few spoke of them openly. The public image of the master had to remain untarnished, a man of honor and refinement. Yet whispers circulated in slave quarters, in hushed conversations among neighbors, and even in the stares of guests who sensed something beneath the surface. The plantation master knew this, and so he worked tirelessly to manage appearances. To the world, he was a man of God, a steward of wealth, a leader among men. In private, his obsession drove him into shadows where cruelty thrived, and where no one dared to intervene. But control has a way of consuming those who seek it. His need to dominate left him restless, paranoid, and increasingly cruel. Every glance from his wife became, in his mind, a judgment on his manhood. Every whisper among the enslaved, he feared, might carry a truth that could reach beyond the plantation. His power was great, yet it never felt secure enough. He believed that only through legacy, through children who bore his blood, could he achieve the permanence he so desperately craved. In this pursuit, his humanity eroded. He became not a protector of family, but its destroyer, not a master of land, but a slave to his own fear. His wealth and influence blinded him to the moral ruin he left in his wake. To him, the end justified the means, humiliation, betrayal, cruelty. None of it mattered so long as his name lived on. The hidden cost of this obsession fell hardest on those around him. His wife bore the silent agony of being made complicit in her own degradation. The enslaved endured the violation of their most basic human rights, forced into roles that stripped them of dignity. Even the children born of these cruel arrangements carried the stigma of being both blood and bondage, trapped between worlds, unacknowledged by the man who had demanded their existence. Control, in the master's world, was never simply about ruling a plantation. It was about bending every person, every circumstance to his will. His fields yielded cotton because he demanded it. His house stood tall because he demanded it. His reputation shone bright because he demanded it. And when nature denied him heirs, he sought to bend even that unyielding truth to his will. His obsession was not with family or love, but with the illusion of immortality through blood. This keynote reveals how the plantation system was never merely economic, but deeply psychological. Men like him believed themselves gods within their own domains, free to shape life according to their desires. Yet in their pursuit of control, they left legacies of pain, suffering, and trauma that endured far beyond their lifetimes. The wealth they guarded so fiercely crumbled with time, but the scars they left behind remained in the memories of those who suffered under their rule. The Master's story in Georgia, 1838, is not just the tale of one man's cruelty. It is a reflection of a culture that prized power above humanity, legacy above morality, and silence above truth. His obsession with control was not his alone. It was a sickness woven into the fabric of the society that enabled him, and though his name may not have survived, the shadow of his actions lingers in history, a reminder of how destructive the hunger for legacy can become. In 1838 Georgia, plantation homes stood as grand symbols of wealth and refinement. Behind their white columns and manicured gardens, however, lived stories of anguish that rarely reached the public eye. One such story belonged to the mistress of the plantation, a woman whose life was draped in silks, but whose heart bore only sorrow. Her suffering was not loud, not violent, not even visible to most who knew her, but it was profound, silent, and suffocating. Marriage for women of her class was never about love. It was an arrangement, a transaction of status, land, and security. She had entered her union with the hope of fulfilling her role as a devoted wife and mother, yet when years passed without a child, her worth was questioned. Society did not blame the husband. The burden fell squarely on her shoulders. To be sterile was to be incomplete, and in a culture where legacy mattered above all, her inability to produce an heir turned her into both an object of pity and a target of scorn. Her husband, the master of the estate, saw her not as a partner, but as an obstacle to his ambitions. To the public, he kept up the facade of marital harmony. At church and gatherings, she stood beside him as the picture of Southern grace. Guests admired her posture, her fine gowns, her delicate hands resting upon the carved pews. But once the visitors left and the doors closed, her life was one of isolation and quiet torment. She lived not as a wife, but as a witness to her husband's cruelty. What tormented her most was not only her inability to bear children, but the way her husband chose to answer that void. He turned to the enslaved women of the plantation, claiming their bodies as his right, and he forced his wife into silent complicity. There were nights when she was made to sit, watching as her husband secured his legacy through acts that violated every moral law she believed in. The humiliation was unbearable. She was not simply betrayed, she was forced to witness her own erasure as a wife, while her husband's power left her with no voice to protest. The cruelty lay in the expectation that she endure all this with grace. Southern society valued appearances above truth, and so she was expected to host dinners, smile at neighbors, and bow her head in church as though nothing were wrong. To reveal her suffering would invite gossip, and gossip could destroy her already fragile standing. Her silence became her armor, but it also became her prison. This silence ate at her daily. In the solitude of her chamber, she wept into embroidered linens. She prayed, begging God for a miracle, a child of her own, a change of heart in her husband, a way out of the torment. Yet her prayers were met only with the same unchanging reality: she was trapped. Divorce was unthinkable in her society. To leave her husband would mean losing everything: her home, her wealth, her respectability. To rebel openly would mean disgrace. She bore her pain in quiet submission, for there was no escape available to women like her. Her suffering was compounded by the cruel paradox of her position. Though she was mistress of the house, with authority over meals, decor, and daily routines, she was powerless in the matters that cut deepest: her own body, her own marriage, her own dignity. She could command servants, but she could not command her husband's respect. She could give orders in the household, but she could not shape her own destiny. The trappings of privilege disguised a truth as harsh as the whip on the fields. She was another victim of the system, albeit in silks rather than chains. Her pain deepened as children began to appear on the plantation who carried the master's blood. Their resemblance was undeniable, yet they were denied acknowledgement. To her, each of these children was both a reminder of her own failure and a living testament to her husband's betrayal. The enslaved women who bore them carried their own suffering, yet in a twisted way, the mistress felt her grief mirrored in theirs. She resented them and pitied them at once, bound together by a cruelty neither had chosen. In public, she smiled. She hosted gatherings where neighbors praised the master's hospitality. She kept her voice soft, her posture perfect, her composure unbroken. But beneath the lace gloves, her hands trembled. Beneath the pearl necklace, her heart ached. Every polite nod, every careful curtsy was a performance to hide a life of despair. Her silence was demanded, and she delivered it flawlessly, but silence did not erase the suffering, it only buried it deeper. The tragedy of her story lies in how invisible her suffering was. Historians record the wealth of her husband, the productivity of the plantation, the children born into bondage, but her pain, the humiliation, the loneliness, the daily act of pretending, remains hidden between the lines. She left no diary, no confessions, for to do so would have risked exposure. Her suffering was unspoken, yet it was real, echoing in the walls of the grand home she could not call her own. This keynote reminds us that cruelty on plantations did not stop at the boundaries of the slave quarters. The system of domination infected every relationship, every bond. The master's obsession with legacy stripped dignity not only from the enslaved, but from his own wife, turning her into a silent witness of his crimes. Her suffering was different, yes, but it was suffering all the same. It was the suffering of silence, of being erased, unseen, and unheard in a world that demanded she smile through her tears. And perhaps the most haunting truth is that her silence was expected to endure beyond her life. After death, she would be remembered not as a woman of sorrow, but as a lady of grace, a model wife, the perfect Southern mistress. Her pain would remain unspoken, sealed within the walls of the plantation house. Only whispers, carried by time, remind us that beneath the elegance there lived a woman broken by humiliation, trapped in a loveless marriage, and crushed under the weight of silence. In the Georgia of 1838, the plantation system thrived on a brutal logic: people could be owned. This idea, written into law and woven into daily life, shaped not only the economy but also the deepest personal relationships on plantations. To the master, the enslaved were not human beings with souls, emotions, and destinies of their own. They were investments, tools, and resources, property to be used, traded, punished, or exploited at will. This view of human lives as commodities formed the dark foundation of his power. And nowhere was this more evident than in the way he wielded his authority over their bodies. The master's world revolved around control, and ownership was its currency. To own land was to command wealth, to own slaves was to multiply that wealth. But beyond money, ownership carried something far more dangerous, the belief in total entitlement. If a man could purchase another person, what limits could exist on his will? The enslaved were reduced to ledgers and breeding charts, their worth measured not in humanity but in productivity, how much cotton they could pick, how strong their backs were, how fertile their wombs might be. This reduction of life into property meant that even the most intimate, sacred aspects of existence were stripped away. Family bonds among the enslaved meant little to the master's ledger. A husband could be sold, a wife traded, a child torn away and sent miles downriver, all without a second thought. The agony of separation was invisible to the master because he did not see them as families. He saw them as units of labor. He spoke of stock and breeding with the same detachment as a cattle farmer, ignoring the fact that behind each set of eyes was a life, a memory, a dream. For the women enslaved on his plantation, this reality cut even deeper. Their wombs were not their own, they were instruments of profit and legacy. The master could force himself upon them, not out of desire but out of calculation. To him, their children represented two things: the possibility of heirs that bore his blood and the expansion of his workforce. It was exploitation disguised as necessity, and society allowed it to flourish. These women had no voice, no shield, and no protection. Their very bodies were claimed as property, stripped of dignity and choice. The plantation mistress, forced to watch this cruelty, became another participant in the system, though unwillingly. Her humiliation was real, but the enslaved women suffered something even more horrific. They carried children born of violation, children who belonged legally not to them but to the master. The paradox was grotesque. A mother gave birth, nurtured her child, and yet had no claim to its future. At any moment, that child could be sold, severed from her arms, treated as nothing more than another piece of the master's estate. This stripping away of humanity had consequences beyond the plantation walls. It seeped into the very culture of the South, shaping how people thought, prayed, and justified their actions. Ministers preached sermons that twisted scripture into chains, declaring slavery ordained by God. Neighbors turned blind eyes to cruelty, insisting it was the natural order of things. The law codified this belief, defining people as property in the cold language of contracts and court rulings. Human beings became entries in estate documents, passed down like silverware from father to son. But while the master treated enslaved lives as property, those lives refused to be extinguished. In the slave quarters, families forged bonds that defied his control. Songs carried memories across generations, whispers of hope traveled from ear to ear, and stories of Africa, freedom, and dignity survived, despite every effort to erase them. Resistance took many forms, some open, others quiet. A mother might teach her child a prayer whispered in secret. A father might steal away a few hours after dusk to hold his family close. A young man might slow his labor, feigning exhaustion, to reclaim a small piece of defiance. These were acts of humanity in a world that sought to strip humanity away. The master's obsession with treating people as tools revealed itself in the cold efficiency of his management. He calculated how many children enslaved women might bear in their lifetimes, estimating how much labor those children would yield once grown. He punished men and women alike with whips, branding scars into their flesh, not to reform them but to remind them of their place as objects of his will. Even death was no release from this cycle of dehumanization. An enslaved person's death was noted not with grief but with loss of value, a subtraction on the ledger. This system not only degraded the enslaved, it corroded the master himself. By denying the humanity of others, he eroded his own. His obsession with control and property turned him into a tyrant whose wealth was built on misery. The legacy he craved was tainted by the cruelty he inflicted, though he refused to see it. He told himself he was preserving his estate, protecting his lineage, but in truth, he was destroying the very soul of his household. To understand the depth of this keynote is to grasp that slavery was not just about forced labor, it was about forced existence. Every moment of an enslaved person's life was claimed by someone else. Their waking hours were dictated, their families torn apart, their futures predetermined. They were denied even the right to own themselves. This denial was the greatest violence of all, for it sought to erase not only freedom but identity. Yet history bears witness to the fact that property does not remain silent. The cries of enslaved mothers, the whispered prayers of fathers, the songs sung under the stars, these echoes carried forward, outlasting the master's wealth and the society that justified him. The plantation has rotted, the ledgers have faded, but the memory of those lives endures. Their humanity, denied in 1838, asserts itself in history with undeniable force. This keynote forces us to confront the brutal truth of Georgia's plantations, that the wealth of one man was built upon the erasure of countless lives. His fields were watered not only with sweat but with tears. His legacy, though he sought to glorify it, is remembered today not with honor but with horror. He treated people as property and tools of power, but in doing so he revealed the darkest truth about himself, that he was less a master and more a prisoner of cruelty, trapped in a system that destroyed everything it touched. On a Georgia plantation in 1838, silence was demanded, but whispers always found a way to survive. In the quarters, where cabins leaned against one another under the dim light of the moon, whispers became lifelines. They carried news, fear, warnings, and fragments of hope. To the enslaved, speaking too loudly invited punishment, but not speaking at all meant surrendering to despair. And so whispers threaded through the nights, weaving a hidden narrative of survival beneath the master's tyranny. The enslaved people knew more than the master believed. Though he saw them as tools, blind to his private sins, they watched everything. They saw the mistress's sorrow in her quiet eyes, the cruelty in the master's gaze, the growing number of children who carried his features. They heard doors closing in the main house at night, heard footsteps in places no one should be, heard muffled cries that never reached the daylight. These observations turned into whispers, whispers that spread from cabin to cabin, from field to field. Fear grew in these exchanges, for knowledge was dangerous. To know too much about the master's secrets could mean punishment, even death. Yet to remain ignorant was impossible, for their lives were bound to his in ways that could not be ignored. The women whispered warnings to each other, who the master's eyes lingered on, who should avoid the shadows of the house, who might be forced to carry his next child. These whispers were both shields and burdens, protecting some while reminding all of their constant vulnerability. The men, too, carried whispers. In the fields, their voices low against the rustle of cotton stalks, they spoke of rebellion and escape. But such talk was laced with fear. They knew stories of others who tried and failed, captured by dogs, whipped until their backs became rivers of scars, or hanged from trees as warnings. Yet even so, the idea of resistance refused to die. Whispers became seeds, seeds of courage planted quietly, waiting for the right moment to break through the soil of fear. The master sensed these undercurrents, though he never admitted it aloud. His paranoia grew as the whispers traveled beyond the quarters. Neighbors gossiped too, sensing that something was wrong in the grand house. Why did the mistress look so hollow? Why did certain enslaved children bear his unmistakable features? Why did servants exchange glances when his name was mentioned? Though no one spoke openly, the atmosphere of the plantation thickened with tension. Fear was not confined to the enslaved alone. It seeped into the master's own heart, for he knew whispers could grow into accusations. The mistress, though silenced in public, also became part of the chain of whispers. She confided in no one openly, but her grief was read by watchful eyes. The enslaved women, especially those closest to the house, saw her suffering. They whispered among themselves, pitying her and fearing her in equal measure. Some despised her silence, believing she allowed the master's cruelty to continue. Others pitied her, recognizing her powerlessness. In either case, she too became a subject of whispered stories, her pain folded into the collective memory of the quarters. Whispers also carried something else: faith. Despite the crushing weight of bondage, enslaved people shared whispered prayers and fragments of scripture. In secret gatherings, often under the guise of late-night chores, they repeated stories of Moses leading his people to freedom. of Daniel surviving the lion's den, of Christ promising deliverance to the suffering. These whispers of faith gave strength where none should have existed, reminding them that even in the Master's world there was a power greater than his whip. But whispers were not only about faith and warning, they were about memory. In the quiet, elders whispered stories of Africa, of ancestors, of freedom before chains. They passed down names, songs, and fragments of language so that the young would know they came from more than bondage. These whispers became acts of resistance, preserving an identity the Master sought to erase. Each word carried a weight heavier than cotton, a defiance that refused to be silenced. Fear, however, was never far behind. Children were taught to whisper carefully, to lower their voices even when playing, to trust only those closest to them. They learned early that a careless word could reach the wrong ears. Overseers had informants. Punishments were swift and brutal. Fear became a constant shadow, stalking every conversation, reminding them that even whispers carried risk. Yet the fact that whispers continued proved something vital. Fear could not extinguish the need for truth, nor the longing for freedom. The Master, blinded by arrogance, underestimated the power of these whispers. He believed his dominance absolute, his secrets secure, but whispers are patient. They build quietly, gathering strength until the right moment arrives. A single whisper could ignite a spark that spread through the quarters, transforming fear into action. Whispers could become songs sung louder, footsteps running northward, or collective resistance that no whip could silence. History shows that plantations like his were never as silent as masters wished to believe. Behind the facade of obedience, whispers carried truths that refused to die. They recorded the crimes no court acknowledged, the sorrows no ledger counted. They preserved the humanity of those treated as property, ensuring that even if voices were beaten down in life, they would echo through time. On this Georgia plantation, the whispers grew louder with every act of cruelty. Each betrayal, each violation, each cry muffled behind the Master's doors added fuel to the quiet fire, and though fear wrapped itself tightly around the enslaved, the whispers still lived. They moved like wind through the night, carrying secrets, sorrows, and seeds of courage from one soul to another. This keynote reminds us that the enslaved, though bound in chains, possessed voices that could not be fully silenced. Their whispers were weapons, not of iron or fire, but of memory, warning, and endurance. They whispered for survival. They whispered for freedom, and they whispered so that history would remember what the Master wished to erase. Fear was real, but whispers proved stronger. In the end, it was not the Master's commands that endured, but the stories carried in hushed tones, passed down until they became history's truth. In the antebellum South, image was everything. A plantation owner's reputation was his currency, his shield, and his pride. To the world, the Master of the Georgia estate in 1838 was a man of refinement and virtue, respected by neighbors and admired by his congregation. His wealth gave him influence, his land gave him power, and his carefully cultivated public persona gave him immunity. But behind the whitewashed walls of his grand home, another truth lurked, a truth of cruelty, betrayal, and corruption that stood in sharp contrast to the mask of respectability he wore for society. Publicly, he played the role of a gentleman flawlessly. On Sundays, he dressed in his finest coat and took his place in the front pew of the local church, his Bible held firmly in his hand. He nodded solemnly during sermons, gave generous donations to the congregation, and led prayers with a voice that resonated with confidence. He hosted dinners that dazzled neighbors, where silverware gleamed under candlelight and the mistress played the gracious hostess. Guests admired his estate, his discipline, his command of all he surveyed. He was, to the community, the very embodiment of Southern honor. But this respectability was a performance, one that demanded silence from those who knew otherwise. Within his home, cruelty reigned. The same man who bowed his head in prayer used his power to degrade both his wife and the enslaved women he violated. He turned his plantation into a theater where appearances mattered more than truth, and everyone, from his wife to his servants, was forced into roles that maintained his illusion of virtue. His cruelty was hidden but not absent. It thrived in the shadows, cloaked by his public mask. The mistress bore the heaviest burden of maintaining this illusion. She was expected to smile at dinners, to sit beside him at church, to embody the grace of a Southern lady. Her silence was part of his performance. Neighbors saw her as a picture of poise, never suspecting, or choosing not to suspect, the humiliation she endured each night. Her suffering was invisible because respectability demanded it remain so. If she ever broke, if she ever revealed the truth, she would be blamed for shattering the image he so carefully curated. For the enslaved, the contradiction between the master's public piety and private cruelty was a daily reality. They watched him quote scripture on Sundays and then wield the whip on Mondays. They heard him speak of Christian duty while tearing families apart through sales and punishment. They saw him stand tall as a moral man in the eyes of the world while committing acts that stripped them of dignity and humanity. To them, his mask was transparent, but they had no power to challenge it. Their truths lived only in whispers, hidden from the society that applauded him. Neighbors, too, were not blind. Whispers of strange happenings at the plantation circulated quietly. Rumors of children who resembled the master, of the mistress's melancholy, of the unusual authority he exerted over the enslaved women in his house. But in a society where wealth excused sin, few dared to confront him. The South's culture of honor demanded loyalty among elites, and so even those who suspected cruelty chose to protect his public image. To expose him would be to destabilize the very fabric of their shared system, and so silence became complicity. This divide between respectability and cruelty was not unique to him, it was a feature of the plantation world. Southern gentlemen built their reputations on hospitality, generosity, and piety, even as their wealth depended on exploitation and violence. Respectability was a mask worn not only by individuals, but by the entire culture, a collective performance designed to hide the blood that watered their prosperity. The grand columns of plantation homes, the polished manners at dinner tables, the sermons in whitewashed churches, all stood as facades built to obscure the brutality beneath. For the master, this mask was more than protection, it was power. By presenting himself as honorable, he disarmed criticism. By cloaking his cruelty in respectability, he made it harder for victims to be believed. Who would accuse such a respected man of corruption? Who would listen to the whispers of enslaved people when his wealth and reputation testified otherwise? Respectability gave him immunity, allowing his cruelty to flourish unchecked. But masks are fragile. Behind the scenes, cracks grew. The mistress's sorrow deepened, visible to those who looked closely. The enslaved whispered more boldly, carrying stories that refused to die. Some neighbors questioned, if only in private, why misfortune seemed to cling to his household. Respectability could conceal, but it could not erase the truth. The longer he maintained his performance, the more brittle it became, for the weight of cruelty cannot remain hidden forever. This keynote reveals the duality of life on plantations, the public world of appearances and the private world of suffering. It forces us to confront the hypocrisy at the heart of the system. Men like the Georgia master presented themselves as paragons of morality, yet they built their lives on degradation and exploitation. They demanded respect from their peers while denying basic humanity to those under their control. They claimed virtue while practicing vice, cloaking cruelty in the language of honor. The consequences of this divide were profound. For the victims, the mistress silenced by duty, the enslaved women violated by power, the master's mask of respectability was another layer of oppression. It denied their truth, erased their pain, and forced them to live within a lie. For the community, the mask became complicity, allowing cruelty to continue unchecked. And for history, the mask threatens to obscure reality unless we peel it away and confront the hidden suffering behind the facade. Respectability was, in the end, a lie. The master's true legacy was not the admiration he cultivated in life, but the cruelty he inflicted in private. His wealth crumbled, his descendants faded, but the stories of his cruelty lived on, carried in whispers, in letters, in the memories of those who refused to forget. His mask of honor shattered long after his death, leaving behind the truth he worked so hard to bury. This keynote is not just about one man. It is about the Southern system that enabled men like him. It reminds us that cruelty often wears a mask, that respectability can be a disguise for corruption, and that history's duty is to uncover the truths hidden behind appearances. The master's public image was his greatest weapon, but in time, it became his greatest betrayal, for it revealed the depth of his hypocrisy and the cost of silence. In the grand estates of the antebellum South, women were often presented as jewels of refinement, guardians of morality and symbols of their husband's success. Yet beneath the lace gowns and polished smiles lay lives marked by silence, repression, and pain. In 1838 Georgia, the wife of the plantation owner exemplified this struggle. She was not merely a mistress of the house, she was a woman caged by societal expectations and trapped within a marriage that demanded obedience while stripping away her dignity. Her struggle began with the simple fact of her barrenness. In a culture where women were valued most for their ability to bear children, especially male heirs, her inability to conceive cast a shadow over her entire existence. Society treated her not as an individual with thoughts and emotions, but as a vessel whose worth was tied to reproduction. Each passing year without a child became a silent accusation. The whispers of neighbors, the pitying glances, and the unspoken comparison to fertile women weighed heavily on her. Her body, which should have been her own, was transformed into a symbol of failure. Marriage, instead of offering her companionship and protection, became another form of prison. Her husband, the master of the plantation, used her sterility not only as justification for betrayal but as a weapon to humiliate her. He forced her to witness his breeding of enslaved women, a practice justified in his mind as both practical and profitable. For her, this was not just an act of cruelty. It was a deliberate breaking of her spirit. Each time she was made to watch, her silence was demanded, her pain dismissed as irrelevant. In this, the marriage became less a union of souls and more a hierarchy of power, where her role was reduced to submission. Silence, however, was not simply enforced within her home, it was woven into the fabric of Southern womanhood. Society expected women to embody purity, piety, and obedience. To speak out against a husband was to risk ridicule, isolation, or even financial ruin. Divorce was rare and scandalous, and for a woman without children, it would have meant disgrace and poverty. She had no true recourse. Her silence was not a choice, it was survival. But silence is not the absence of feeling. Inside, she lived with a storm of emotions, humiliation at being forced to endure such cruelty, jealousy at seeing enslaved women bear children that might be claimed as her husband's heirs, grief at the loss of the life she had imagined, and shame at her own inability to resist. Her silence became a wound that deepened with each passing day. This struggle also reveals the broader paradox faced by Southern women. While enslaved women endured physical exploitation, mistresses often endured psychological and emotional abuse. The wife, despite her elevated social position, was powerless in her own home. Her voice was drowned out by her husband's authority and society's expectations. She lived within a gilded cage, wealth surrounded her, yet she could not control the most intimate aspects of her life. What made her struggle particularly cruel was the performative nature of her role. In public, she had to maintain the appearance of dignity and grace. She was expected to host gatherings, smile at neighbors, and embody the charm of Southern femininity. No one saw, or chose not to see, the despair in her eyes. Her silence was part of her husband's respectability, just as much as his fine clothes and polished sermons. She was an actor in his performance, bound to play the part of the loyal wife, even as her heart fractured behind closed doors. The enslaved women on the plantation understood her suffering in ways that few others could. They, too, were silenced, though in different ways. They endured the master's touch without consent, bore his children without recognition, and lived under the constant threat of violence. In a twisted way, the mistress and the enslaved women were united in pain, though divided by race, power, and privilege. Yet even in this shared suffering, society ensured they would remain apart. The mistress too ashamed to acknowledge their common bondage, the enslaved too vulnerable to risk sympathy. Her struggle was not just personal, but generational. Women like her carried silent burdens that were passed down in the shadows of Southern households. Letters written in secret, journals hidden away, or simply the sorrow etched into the faces of mistresses. Tell us today of their silenced voices. These women represent the cost of a system that elevated male dominance above all else. They were not allowed to protest, not allowed to shape their destiny, not allowed to reclaim their dignity. Still, silence was not always absolute. In rare moments, women like her resisted in subtle ways. Perhaps she refused to look at her husband during his humiliating displays. Perhaps she wrote letters that would never be sent, pouring out the pain she could not voice aloud. Perhaps her silence was not acquiescence, but endurance, a way to survive long enough to preserve her sanity. For some women, endurance itself was a form of rebellion, a quiet refusal to be completely broken. The story of the mistress's struggle forces us to confront the gendered cruelty of the South. While slavery brutalized black women physically and emotionally, the patriarchal system also crushed white women within its grip. They were complicit in slavery, yet victims of a system that denied them autonomy. Their marriages, their motherhood, and even their emotions were controlled by men who valued them only as adornments or vessels. In remembering her, we see the broader tragedy of women silenced by marriage and society. Her pain was not just her own, it was the collective pain of countless women trapped in systems designed to deny them voice. Her story is a reminder that silence is itself a wound, one that history must break open if we are to understand the full scope of suffering in that era. The mistress of 1838 Georgia lived her life in shadows, smiling in public and weeping in private. She carried her struggle silently to the grave, leaving behind only the faintest traces of her sorrow. Yet her silence speaks volumes today, reminding us of the cost of a world where women's voices were suppressed, where marriage was a cage, and where dignity was sacrificed on the altar of obedience. Her struggle was not unique, but in its telling it becomes a testimony. It reveals the hidden side of plantation life, the untold anguish behind the facade of grandeur. And it forces us to ask, how many women lived and died unheard, their silence echoing through history, their stories waiting to be told. The deepest scars of plantation cruelty were not carved only into the lives of the enslaved or the humiliated mistress. They stretched into the lives of children, innocent beings born of exploitation, caught between worlds and forced to carry the burden of sins not their own. On the Georgia plantation of 1838, the children conceived through the master's abuse of enslaved women stood as living reminders of his brutality. They embodied the collision of power, race, and shame, and their existence carried consequences for generations. To the master, these children were contradictions. On one hand, they were proof of his virility and power. They demonstrated his ability to breed, to extend his bloodline, even if his legitimate wife could not. On the other hand, they were inconvenient, dangerous reminders of his hypocrisy. Their very faces often betrayed the truth, with features that mirrored his own, exposing what he wished to keep hidden. Some were acknowledged quietly, given lighter labor or privileges within the house. Others were denied, cast out into the fields, or sold away, severed from any connection that might reveal too much. For the mistress, these children were daggers to the heart. Each one was a reminder of her husband's betrayal, her humiliation, and her own perceived inadequacy. To see enslaved women bearing children where she could not must have felt like salt poured into an open wound. Worse still, society expected her to remain silent, to treat these children as part of the plantation economy rather than as evidence of her personal tragedy. Her role demanded composure, but inside, each child was a symbol of her pain. For the enslaved women who bore them, the children represented both joy and terror. They loved their children fiercely as any mother would, but they lived with the constant fear of loss. The master might choose to sell the child for profit, or the mistress might demand the child be removed as a reminder of her shame. Some children grew up with uncertain status, caught between enslavement and privilege, never fully belonging to either world. For the mothers, survival meant navigating this fragile space, protecting their children when possible and enduring the anguish when protection failed. The children themselves carried the heaviest burden. Born into a system that defined identity by blood, they were trapped in a world that saw them as property first, human second. Society labeled them with terms like mulatto, Sant Quadroon, or octoroon. reducing their existence to fractions, a cruel arithmetic of ancestry that denied them individuality. They were too black to be accepted by white society, too marked by their father's power to be fully embraced by the enslaved community without complication. Their existence was a reminder that the boundaries of race and power were not as clear as the South wished to believe. As they grew, their lives diverged. Some, especially those the master favored, were given education, training, or lighter labor. They might become skilled artisans, household servants, or intermediaries between the master and the enslaved community. But this privilege came with isolation. They were distrusted by both sides, resented by white society for their blood, resented by some enslaved peers for the privileges they received. Others, denied acknowledgement, lived and labored in the fields, indistinguishable from their peers except for whispers about their paternity. For them, exploitation was both their origin and their daily reality. The weight of legacy extended beyond the plantation. When the Civil War ended and emancipation came, many of these children and their descendants entered a world that refused to forget their origins. The stigma of illegitimacy, the whispers of their lineage, and the color of their skin marked them for discrimination. They carried the master's blood, but not his name, his features, but not his protection, his legacy, but none of his power. Their lives became testimonies to the hypocrisy of a society that proclaimed racial purity while blurring it in private acts of violence. The mistress's silence, the enslaved mother's resilience, and the master's hypocrisy all converged in these children. They were the embodiment of truth society wished to deny. Their very existence threatened the carefully constructed narratives of white superiority and Southern honor. To acknowledge them was to admit the violence and corruption at the heart of the plantation system. Thus, society often chose to erase them, through denial, through silence, or through the brutality of the slave market. Yet these children were not only victims of legacy, they were also bearers of resilience. Many grew to carve lives of survival and even defiance. Some passed into white society, passing as white to escape the chains of prejudice. Others embraced their black identity, joining communities that resisted oppression and built new futures after slavery. Their lives, though shaped by exploitation, also testified to endurance, adaptation, and the refusal to be erased. The legacy of these children did not end with their lifetimes. It echoes through history, in the bloodlines of families across the South, in the unspoken secrets carried through generations, and in the enduring scars of racial inequality in America. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths, that the Southern aristocracy was built not only on slavery, but also on sexual violence, that the myth of purity was always a lie, and that children bore the cost of sins they did not commit. The weight of legacy lies in memory as well. Letters, journals, and oral histories from descendants reveal the hidden lives of these children. Some families discovered generations later that their lineage traced back to the very masters who owned their ancestors. For others, the silence persisted. Stories never told, questions never answered, because the shame was too great to bear. This silence is part of the legacy, too. A reminder that exploitation does not end with one lifetime, but ripples forward through the years. The story of these children forces us to look beyond the image of the plantation as merely fields and labor. It was also a place where human lives were entangled in contradictions, where innocence was tainted by cruelty, and where legacies were shaped by exploitation. The children of 1838. Georgia remind us that history is not only about the powerful, but about those caught in the crossfire of power, those who carried the weight of choices they never made, who bore the mark of violence in their very existence. Their lives compel us to ask difficult questions. How many descendants of exploitation walk among us today, unaware of their true origins? How many family trees carry hidden branches erased by shame? How do we honor the resilience of those children while acknowledging the cruelty of their conception? In the end, the children of exploitation are both a tragedy and a testament. They reveal the darkest truths of slavery while also embodying survival against impossible odds. They carried the master's blood but refused to be only his legacy of shame. They carried their mother's strength, their community's resilience, and the possibility of futures unimagined. And in remembering them, we confront not only their past, but our own present, shaped by the weight of legacies that still linger. In 1838, Georgia, the plantation owner's cruelty did not exist in isolation. His actions, his hypocrisy, and the suffering within his household were not entirely hidden from the world outside his gates. Neighbors noticed. They whispered. They suspected. But suspicion rarely turned into confrontation, and whispers rarely became accusations. Instead, silence reigned. This silence, whether born of fear, indifference, or self-interest, was not neutral. It was complicity, a social contract that allowed cruelty to thrive under the veil of respectability. The antebellum South was built on a delicate balance of appearances. Plantation owners depended on one another for reputation, influence, and protection. Honor was the lifeblood of Southern society. To accuse a fellow landowner of cruelty, corruption, or immorality was to risk destabilizing the very system that bound them all together. It threatened not just one man, but the collective image of the Southern elite. And so, when whispers rose about the Georgia master's exploitation of enslaved women, or the strange sadness that hung over his wife, most neighbors chose silence. This silence was not ignorance. Signs of abuse were present, visible to those who dared look. Enslaved women bore children who resembled the master, children who could not be explained away as coincidence. The mistress's withdrawn demeanor spoke volumes about her suffering. The comings and goings of certain men, the timing of pregnancies, the stories told quietly among enslaved communities, all pointed to a darker truth. Yet neighbors looked away, reassuring themselves that it was not their business, or worse, that such matters were natural and expected in plantation life. There were layers to this complicity. Some neighbors were bound by loyalty. The culture of honor meant protecting one's peers, even in the face of wrongdoing. Others were bound by self-interest. To expose another man's cruelty might invite scrutiny into their own affairs, for few plantation homes were free of sin. Many landowners kept their own secrets, infidelities, hidden children, or acts of brutality, and silence became a mutual shield. By protecting one another, they protected themselves. The church, too, played a role in sustaining this silence. Ministers preached about obedience, morality, and Christian duty, yet often avoided direct condemnation of the sins committed by their wealthiest congregants. Donations from plantation owners funded the church's survival, and piety was often measured in gold rather than deeds. To speak against a respected landowner was to risk division, scandal, and financial loss. Thus, the pulpit echoed with general sermons on virtue, while carefully avoiding the realities of exploitation simmering in the pews. Ordinary townsfolk, shopkeepers, overseers, small farmers, also participated in this silence, though often in different ways. Some genuinely believed that questioning the social order was dangerous, even sinful. Others feared retribution. A man who accused a wealthy planter of corruption might find himself ostracized, his business ruined, or worse. In the South, power was not just economic. It was social and violent. Speaking out carried consequences, and silence became the safer choice. This complicity was not passive. By refusing to intervene, neighbors enabled cruelty to continue. Each polite dinner attended, each Sunday service shared, each exchange of pleasantries was a form of validation. The master's public mask of respectability was strengthened by the very silence of those who knew better. It allowed him to exploit without fear, to wield power without challenge, and to pretend his home was one of virtue rather than violence. The silence also extended into the realm of enslaved people's voices. When rumors of abuse spread among the enslaved community, they carried truth, but in a world where enslaved testimony was dismissed as unreliable, their voices held little weight. Neighbors could ignore what enslaved people said because society had already decided their words were less than human truth. The silencing of enslaved voices made it easier for neighbors to deny responsibility, to pretend they did not know. Yet cracks in this silence sometimes appeared. A neighbor might privately express unease. A minister might allude, in vague terms, to the dangers of sin. A midwife might whisper about children born with suspicious features. But these cracks rarely widened into open confrontation. The weight of social expectation closed them quickly, with reminders that it was unladylike to gossip, unwise to meddle, or dishonorable to accuse a fellow gentleman. The system depended on maintaining appearances, and appearances demanded silence. The tragedy of this complicity was that it transformed individual cruelty into a collective crime. The master's sins were his own, but the silence of society allowed them to persist and multiply. Each neighbor who turned away, each friend who shielded him, each minister who refused to name his sins became part of the machinery that protected him. Cruelty was not merely a personal failing, it was woven into the very fabric of the community. This silence reveals a painful truth about the antebellum South. Its social order was built on denial. To preserve the image of honor, people denied the humanity of the enslaved, denied the suffering of mistresses, denied the abuses of men they called friends. They told themselves lies, that enslaved women consented, that wives were content, that children of mixed heritage were anomalies. These lies were easier than facing the truth, easier than acknowledging that the system they defended was built on exploitation and hypocrisy. The complicity of neighbors also had lasting consequences. By failing to intervene, they allowed generations of children to be born into exploitation, allowed women to suffer in silence, and allowed cruelty to masquerade as respectability. Their silence became part of history's silence, erasing stories that only later resurfaced through letters, diaries, or oral traditions. Today, when we uncover these stories, we confront not only the master's brutality, but the community's collective failure to act. Yet we must also understand that silence itself was shaped by fear. Fear of ostracism, fear of violence, fear of destabilizing a society that many depended on. It does not excuse complicity, but it explains its persistence. Silence was easier than truth, safer than confrontation, more comfortable than change. And so the neighbors of 1838 Georgia kept their peace, even as cruelty flourished in their midst. The story of the neighbors' silence forces us to ask difficult questions. How often do we, in our own time, choose silence over confrontation? How often do communities protect abusers because acknowledging the truth would shatter reputations, families, or institutions? The echoes of 1838 remind us that silence is never neutral. It is a choice, and it is a choice that empowers the oppressor. In the end, the plantation owner's cruelty was not his alone. It belonged also to the neighbors who chose not to see, to the ministers who chose not to speak, to the community that chose not to act. Their silence was the soil in which his brutality grew, and their complicity ensured that his legacy of pain endured. The silence of society was not absence, it was presence, a presence that weighed as heavily as the whip, the chain, or the command of the master. The story of the Georgia plantation in 1838, with its cruelty hidden behind polished walls and whispered rumors, did not end with the deaths of those who lived it. Its legacy stretched far beyond the lifetime of the master, his wife, the enslaved women, and the children born of exploitation. History is not a closed book. It is a living current, flowing into the present. The abuses of the past echo in the inequalities of today, and the silences of society then continue to shape the silences we grapple with now. The first layer of legacy lies in memory. The plantation owner may have believed that his wealth, his influence, and his mask of respectability would shield him from judgment. But history has a way of unearthing what was buried. Letters discovered decades later, diaries kept in secret, and oral traditions passed down among descendants revealed truths he worked so hard to suppress. In these fragments, we see the endurance of memory, the mistress's grief, the enslaved women's resilience, the children's complicated identities. Memory became resistance to erasure, a way of ensuring that cruelty would not remain hidden forever. But legacy is not just memory, it is consequence. The children born of exploitation carried forward both trauma and resilience. Their descendants inherited the scars of silence, the shame of unacknowledged parentage, and the burden of racial divisions that still persist. Some lived lives shaped by passing into whiteness, erasing parts of themselves for safety. Others embraced their black identity, joining communities that resisted oppression. Yet all lived with the consequences of a society that had reduced them to fractions of blood and denied them full humanity. Their lives remind us that slavery was not simply a system of labor, but a system of lineage, one that shaped families, communities, and identities for generations. The mistress's silence, too, became part of the legacy. Southern women of her time were taught to endure, to suffer quietly, to conceal their pain behind smiles and civility. That silence has carried forward in cultural memory, an unspoken lesson about how women are expected to endure humiliation, betrayal, or abuse for the sake of appearances. Her story, once hidden, becomes powerful in its telling, because it exposes how patriarchal control shaped not only enslaved women's lives, but the lives of white women who were also bound by the same oppressive system, though in different ways. Her silence is a warning to us. When suffering is hidden, injustice thrives. For the neighbors and community, their complicity is part of the lesson. The silence of 1838 Georgia was not unique. Societies across time have chosen to look away from cruelty when speaking out was inconvenient or dangerous. By protecting the reputation of one man, they became complicit in the suffering of many. Their silence reminds us that injustice is never the burden of the oppressor alone. It is the burden of every person who chooses not to see, not to act, not to speak. The legacy of their complicity challenges us today. When faced with abuse, exploitation, or corruption in our own communities, will we remain silent too? The historical legacy of the plantation system also shaped the broader American story. The myths of Southern honor, the insistence on racial hierarchies, and the denial of exploitation were not buried with the Civil War. They seeped into Reconstruction, into Jim Crow laws, into economic and social inequalities that still mark the United States. The story of one plantation becomes part of the story of a nation, a reminder that the sins of the past do not disappear but transform into new forms unless confronted directly. One of the most important lessons from this history is the danger of masks, of respectability that hides cruelty, of wealth that cloaks exploitation, of power that silences truth. The plantation owner's ability to maintain a public image of honor while privately committing acts of violence shows how easily societies can be deceived by appearances. Today we must ask, what masks do our leaders wear? What cruelties are hidden behind polished images, respectable titles, or charitable gestures? The past teaches us to question appearances, to look beneath the surface, to demand truth even when it is uncomfortable. Another lesson lies in the resilience of those who suffered. Despite the horrors they endured, enslaved women found ways to resist, to nurture their children, to pass down traditions, and to preserve dignity. The mistress, though silenced, endured in her own way, surviving humiliation that might have broken others. The children, though born into exploitation, carved lives out of impossible circumstances. Their resilience is a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, human dignity persists. To honor them is not only to remember their suffering, but to recognize their strength. The legacy also speaks to the importance of storytelling. For too long, the voices of the enslaved, the silenced wives, and the children of exploitation were excluded from the official narratives of history. Plantation owners filled the record books with their triumphs, their profits, their versions of honor. But the true history was written in hidden letters, in whispered stories, in the quiet endurance of those who had no official voice. Today, by telling these stories, by uncovering what was buried, we resist the erasure that allowed exploitation to flourish. Storytelling becomes a form of justice. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is the cost of silence. The silence of the mistress, enforced by marriage and society, allowed her husband's cruelty to continue unchecked. The silence of neighbors allowed the system of exploitation to persist. The silence of history threatened to erase the suffering of generations. Silence is not neutral. It is a choice, and it is often the choice that enables injustice. The legacy of 1838. Georgia warns us that silence today, in the face of oppression, will echo into tomorrow just as it did then. As we confront this history, we are faced with difficult questions. How do we honor the pain of those who suffered? How do we ensure their stories are not forgotten? How do we confront the legacies of exploitation that persist in inequality, prejudice, and silence today? The answers are not simple, but the lessons are clear. To remember, to speak, to resist silence, to honor resilience, and to demand justice where cruelty once hid behind masks. The plantation owner believed his wealth and status would shield him from judgment. In his lifetime, perhaps it did. His neighbors whispered but did not confront him. His church accepted his donations. His wife endured his cruelty in silence. His enslaved victims had no voice in the society that oppressed them. But history has judged differently. Today, he is remembered not as a man of honor, but as a symbol of hypocrisy, cruelty, and exploitation. His victims, once silenced, are now the voices that matter. That is the ultimate legacy. Truth rises. However long it takes, however deeply it is buried, truth demands to be told. And in telling it, we not only honor the past, we learn how to shape a more just future. The lessons of 1838, Georgia, are not only about what was done then, but about what we must do now. Refuse silence, question masks, and give voice to those who history has long ignored.